Hello, I'm Ursula Goodenough, and I presented a two-part slideshow here for you. One is this one, and then there's one that follows. Both are engaged in exploring a religious naturalist orientation. And in this presentation, we'll look at everybody's story, the foundation for religious naturalist orientation. And then in the next slide, we will look at religious responses to everybody's story. So humans are many things, but for our purposes, what's very important are two things. Humans are symbolic beings, and we are narrative beings. What do I mean by that? I mean that we are unique in our use of symbolic language. Other animals communicate, but we do it in our particular way. And these symbols point to underlying meanings and understandings. We then organize and remember these understandings as language-based narratives. So much research has concluded that we remember things, we organize things, everything we think, it takes narrative form. And because of this, perhaps, we also each construct a narrative self. There's an Ursula who wakes up in the morning and goes to bed at night and has an autobiography, and that is true of each of you as well. We are narratives through and through. So perhaps not surprisingly, each religious tradition that we know of has a core narrative as well, called a mythos, a large story, lots of names for it. So in your tradition of origin, in the Jewish tradition, it might be the stories of the Old Testament, Christian tradition, the life of Christ, Buddhist tradition, the life of Buddha, and so on. What happens then is that interpretations are embedded into each mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. So a preacher might read a passage from Matthew and then in the sermon interpret that passage in terms of the narrative of Christianity. In addition, spiritual responses to each mythos are elicited using art and ceremony, again, usually administered by religious leaders. And finally, moral and ethical edicts are built into the fabric of each mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. So, this passage means that thou shalt not. So it turns out that scientific inquiry has provisioned us with a mind-blowing new core narrative. So science used to give us just pieces of the whole, but now it's been integrated into something that's been called the history of nature, the epic of evolution, the epic of creation, the universe story, the new story, lots of names. My favorite name is everybody's story because it applies to everyone and has been created by scientists working in all parts of the globe. So here's a busy outline of everybody's story, which we can immediately break up into pieces and start with the story of the observable universe, which began more than 13 billion years ago. This tells us of a singularity followed by a big bang, followed by galaxies with stars, followed by nucleosynthesis in dying stars, and then supernovas that spread new kinds of atoms into the universe. So to get a feel of this, imagine that you were enrolling in college 13 billion years ago and looking at the curriculum. And what you would find is that the curriculum offers during this period would be solely physics and mathematics. That's all that was going on. But then, about 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system arose. We first had the sun and the planet Earth, and then evolution of life on Earth. Evolution of the Earth itself, its continents and its seas. And here we would take courses in chemistry and geology. And now to where I was going, the story of life on Earth, starting perhaps 3.7 billion years ago, where we have the origin of life and then the evolution of life, living to such commonalities as awareness in all creatures and the interdependence of all creatures. And at this point, we would be able to take courses in biology and in ecology. And finally, focusing on what we're of interest here is the evolution of animal minds that started perhaps 500 million years ago. And from there, we get to social minds 300 million years ago. Then our own lineage, hominid minds, maybe 6 million years ago. And then human minds, perhaps 160,000 million years ago, a big leap. So now we have all the courses that we would expect to find: psychology, sociology, anthropology, and the humanities. So the humanities consist of our art, our music, our human history, our philosophy, and of course, our religions. And these are all created and transmitted via language-based human cultures. And these cultures are all a part of nature. We are not a part. We are a part and not a part. So let's look at some visuals of this story. Here are galaxies as seen by the early Hubble telescope. And if you look closer, you have lots of stars in the foreground and then a spiral galaxy in the background. The stars have a life. They are born. They then eventually die in some sort of way. And an important way that they die is that they form a supernova. They get large and then literally explode, as we see here. And a very important event occurs during these supernova formations. If we look at the periodic table here, we see that hydrogen and helium, the first two atoms in the table, are the only ones that were in the original universe. But with the compression and the nucleosynthesis going on in these dying stars, we get all of the other atoms in the periodic table, except some that are formed by humans down at the bottom. And many of these are parts of our own bodies. So we are recycled star stuff. Here's our own galaxy, the Milky Way, which we can't see, but we can diagram. And our solar system is there in the middle. It's called us. And here is what the Milky Way looks like when we're standing on the Earth and looking at it in awe. Here's a picture that just came out from the exploring modules on Mars that looked back and took the picture of the Earth. When we get closer, we get these familiar images of our Earth as the pale blue dot, and we see continents, we see the atmosphere, and we see the oceans. So the Earth has itself been evolving since it formed, the continents moving about. If we look at the continents 150 million years ago, we see that Africa and South America are combined and everything is closer. Whereas if we look 450 million years ago, everything is down at the bottom and looks completely unrecognizable to us. These continental plate movements and the shifting oceans and the shifting climates have had everything to do with the evolution of life. So So the evolution of life has gone through what we can call 3 stages, going from non-life to proto-life, and then to the origins of modern life. So the non-life to proto-life transition here on the left, which occurred maybe 3.7 billion years ago, gave rise to a simple form that doesn't exist, but that underwent evolution, most of the trajectories that it took being unsuccessful and blocked, as shown by these arrows with the blockage signs. But one lineage kept on going, and about 3 billion years ago, this common ancestor, as we call it, was then divided into the 3 major groups of modern life, called bacteria, eukaryotes, and archaea. So here's that same thing diagrammed differently. The common ancestor is in the middle with the red arrow, and the 3 radiations are shown here. The archaea and bacteria are very small. The eukaryotes are larger and can be more complex. And we know this is the case because if we take genes from, let's say, an archaea and put them into a human cell, the genes work just fine, and may find genes in the human cell that are very much like the archaea cell. We are all very deeply genetically related. So let's look at the eukaryotes, because that's us. And what we see is a number of radiations, and I encourage you to see if you can find ours. So there it is. And if we look at our common ancestry, going back in time, we see that our closest relatives are critters called choanoflagellates. We share a common ancestor with choanoflagellates. And if we look at what choanoflagellates are, they look like this. They're single-celled organisms. They have a flagellum that beats about to get bacteria that then go into that little cage and into the cell. Very elegant, but very simple, of course, compared to the animals. Another way of understanding these relationships is with this diagram. On the upper left, we see all of the eukaryotes. The bacteria and the archaea are not on here, and their various patterns of evolution and common descent. On the upper right, we just see the animal sector with lots of common ancestry giving rise to the various animals, and we now see where the humans are. You are here. The lower left, blown up again, you are here, and finally we can read our name, Homo sapiens, with 2 rodents to the right of us and 2 amphibians to the left of us. So a key feature of everybody's story, then, is that all beings share common ancestry, all the way back to the first common ancestor. We're all interrelated. If we now go to our own lineage, at the bottom of the V is the common ancestor to the orangutan and everybody else. Going up, we come to the common ancestor of the gorilla and everyone else. Then the common ancestor of the human and the 2 kinds of chimpanzees that diverged after the humans split off. The line up to the modern human includes such now extinct hominids as Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and so on. But we finally get to the human about 160,000 years ago. And here's a picture of one such skull found in Ethiopia. And an artist has taken the skull and created a picture of what that person would have looked like. And of course, that person has black skins, since all humans originally were from Africa and were black-skinned. If we look at this, we come to, I think, a very important reminder that Terry Deacon has given us. Biologically, we are just another ape. Mentally, we are a whole new phylum of organism. And the parts of us that are different, our human uniqueness, take us back to our first slide. We have this symbolic and narrative language. We construct a narrative self. And we also construct language-based cultures in which we live. And now we'll go to religious responses to everybody's story that comprise the religious naturalist orientation.